Episode title: The Ghost of the Red Internet. Welcome to Synapse Daily. Chapter 1: The Cybernetic Dream, a Nervous System for the Empire. The Complexity Crisis of 1970. By the dawn of the 1970s, the Soviet Union was facing a mathematical apocalypse. The dream of a centrally planned economy was becoming a logistical nightmare. Every single economic interaction, from the production of a single transistor in Minsk to the distribution of wheat in Kazakhstan, had to be calculated, approved, and logged by the Central Planning Agency, Gosplan. The statistics were terrifying. Experts warned the Kremlin that if the economy continued to diversify, the sheer volume of paperwork would require 100% of the Soviet population to work in administration by 1980. The information burden was crushing the revolution. In this atmosphere of impending collapse, a radical idea emerged: what if the state wasn't managed by fallible men, but by an infallible machine? This was the birth of the ASU, Automated Management System. It wasn't just a software package, it was a total reimagining of human society. The scientists envisioned a three-tier hierarchy of data. Tier 1, 20,000 local computer centers at the factory level, capturing real-time production data. Tier 2, hundreds of regional hubs in major cities, aggregating data to spot regional trends. Tier 3, the main computing center in Moscow, where the ultimate economic decisions would be made by a digital czar. This wasn't just automation, it was the attempted creation of an artificial intelligence for an entire empire. The dream was to eliminate the bullwhip effect in supply chains and reach a state of perfect equilibrium. Chapter 2: Viktor Glushkov, the Prophet of the Wired State. The man who saw the 21st century. Viktor Mikhailovich Glushkov was not just a mathematician, he was a prophet of the information age. While the West was focused on individual empowerment through personal computing, Glushkov was focused on the collective power of the network. He founded the Institute of Cybernetics in Kiev, turning it into a fortress of forward-thinking logic. Glushkov's vision, known as OGAS, was light years ahead of its time. He proposed a unified state network that would handle not just industrial data, but all financial transactions. He advocated for the complete abolition of physical currency in favor of electronic receipts, essentially proposing a state-run cryptocurrency or digital ledger 40 years before Bitcoin. Glushkov was a man of intense energy. He spent his nights studying the failures of the Soviet supply chain and his days lobbying the Politburo. He argued that the Iron Curtain was no longer enough. The USSR needed a silicon shield. He understood that whoever controlled the flow of data would control the destiny of nations. However, Glushkov's brilliance was also his greatest liability. He was a technocrat in a land of ideologues. He believed that logic could replace politics. He didn't realize that in the Kremlin, a machine that told that objective truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. Chapter 3: The Ghost in the Machine, the Technology of 1970. The hardware of a superpower. To build a digital god, you need incredible iron. The Soviet Union's answer was the BSM-6. To this day, computer historians speak of the BSM-6 with reverence. It was a 48-bit system that operated at speeds of 1 million instructions per second, MIPS. It featured advanced concepts like virtual memory and instruction pipelining, technologies that the West was only beginning to standardize. But the ASU was more than just the BSM-6. It was an attempt to network thousands of incompatible machines across a landscape that lacked a reliable telephone infrastructure. While the Americans were developing ARPANET using high-quality lines, Soviet engineers had to figure out how to transmit digital data over noisy, analog wires that often failed during a snowstorm. The dirty data problem. The most significant technical hurdle wasn't the hardware, it was the garbage in, garbage out, GIGO principle. In a planned economy, truth is subjective. If a factory manager in the Urals was told to produce 5,000 valves but only produced 4,000, he would report 5,000 to avoid the gulag or a demotion. The ASU was designed to be a truth machine, but it was being fed a diet of systemic lies. Glushkov's algorithms were calculating the future based on a fictional past. This created a digital hallucination, where the central computer believed the country was swimming in resources that didn't actually exist. Chapter 4: The Bureaucratic Sabotage, Murder at the Kremlin. The night the future died. It is October 6, 1970. The room is cold. The air is thick with the smell of stale tea and old paper. Viktor Glushkov stands at the podium. He is sweating. He is facing the Politburo. These are the most powerful men in the Soviet Union. Most are over 70 years old. They do not understand computers. They barely understand telephones. Glushkov begins his pitch. He asks for 20 billion rubles. It is a staggering sum. It is more than the cost of the entire Soviet space program. He tells them, the economy is a living organism. Right now, it is paralyzed. We need a digital brain. The silent assassin. Then, Vasily Garbuzov stands up. He is the Minister of Finance. He is a master of the gray system. He does not scream. He does not argue with the science. Instead, he uses fear. He whispers into the ears of the leaders. Comrades, think about this, he says. If a machine manages the money, who manages the machine? He tells them the ASU is a Trojan horse. He claims the scientists want to steal power from the party. He calls it technocratic coup. He frames the computer as a rival to the General Secretary. The red tape news. The atmosphere in the room shifts. The old men look at the flashing lights on Glushkov's diagrams. They see a threat. They don't see progress. They see a box that cannot be bribed. They see a network that does not care about family titles. Garbuzov wins. The Politburo denies the funding. They don't kill the project entirely. That would be too obvious. Instead, they decentralize it. They give every ministry their own small, isolated computer. They ensure these computers can never speak to each other. They cut the tongue out of the digital god. The red internet was murdered in that room. It was not a technical failure. It was a political execution. Chapter 5, The Chilean Connection, Cybersyn and the Alternate Path. The Santiago Experiment. While Glushkov was being stifled in Moscow, a mirror reality was unfolding in Chile. In 1971, President Salvador Allende commissioned British cyberneticist Stafford Beer to build Project Cybersyn. This is a crucial chapter because it proves that digital socialism wasn't just a Soviet fantasy, it was a global movement. Cybersyn was the anti-ASU. While the Soviet system was a heavy, brutalist hierarchy designed to enforce central command, Cybersyn was designed around viable system models. It focused on autonomy. The ops room in Santiago looked like a sci-fi movie set, hexagonal chairs with built-in buttons, flashing screens, and a futuristic aesthetic. The Soviet engineers watched Chile with envy. Glushkov saw in Cybersyn the flexibility he was denied. But the tragedy was doubled. Cybersyn was destroyed by Pinochet's coup in 1973, and the Soviet ASU was slowly strangled by its own creators. This comparison reveals the ultimate flaw. The ASU wasn't failing because it was socialist, it was failing because it was Stalinist in its DNA. It lacked the feedback loops that Beer and Glushkov knew were essential for any living system. Chapter 6, The Era of the Clones, Piracy as State Policy. The Ryad Project. By the mid-1970s, the Kremlin realized they were losing the hardware race. Their response was one of the greatest heists in history, the ESEVM, Unified System of Electronic Computers, project. The order was simple: stop innovating, start copying. The Soviet Union decided to clone the IBM System/360. They smuggled IBM mainframes through neutral countries, dismantled them, and attempted to replicate every circuit. This decision was a double-edged sword for the ASU. On one hand, it provided a standard architecture. On the other, it turned the Soviet Union into a second-class passenger in the digital age. Every time the West made a leap in silicon technology, the USSR had to wait for the KGB to steal the blueprints. This follower strategy poisoned the ASU. The software was never fully optimized for the hardware. The result was a Frankenstein system, part Soviet genius, part American blueprint, held together by buggy code and patriotic hope. The ASU became a digital shadow of Western technology, forever running a race it had already conceded. Chapter 7: The Shadow in the Code, the Factory Hackers. The War Against the Screen. Imagine you are a factory manager in 1975. Your factory is in the middle of Siberia. You are cold. You are tired. Suddenly, a technician arrives. He installs a glowing green screen. He tells you, this is the ASU. It will monitor everything. You realize your life is over. For 20 years, you have lied about your production. You reported 10,000 shoes, but you only made 8,000. You used the extra leather to trade for car parts on the black market. This was the Blatt system. It was the oil that kept the Soviet engine turning. Now, the machine is watching. The first Soviet hackers. The managers did not panic. They adapted. They became the first hackers of the Eastern Bloc. They didn't use code. They used strategic input. They learned the rhythm of the algorithm. If the ASU expected a 5% growth, the manager typed in 5.1%. It didn't matter if the factory was actually on fire. The screen wanted 5.1%. So, the manager gave it 5.1%. They created a ghost factory inside the computer. On the screen, the USSR was a paradise. Production was perfect. Logistics were seamless. But on the factory floor, the machines were rusting. There was no leather. There were no shoes. The loop of lies. This was the mirror trap. The ASU in Moscow received the data. It processed the lies. It calculated a new plan based on those lies. Then, it sent the new plan back to the factory. The plan was impossible. So, the manager lied even more. The dirty data poisoned the entire system. The digital brain was hallucinating. It believed the country was swimming in resources. In reality, the shelves were empty. People were waiting 6 hours for a loaf of bread. The computer was happy. The people were starving. This was the true legacy of the sabotaged ASU. It didn't solve the plan. It just made the lies move at the speed of light. Chapter 8: The Telephone Line to Nowhere, the Infrastructure Gap. The Copper Bottleneck. A network is only as strong as its weakest link. For the ASU, that link was the Soviet telephone network. In 1970, the US was laying high-capacity coaxial cables. The USSR was still struggling with party-line copper wires from the 1940s. When the ASU tried to transmit packets of industrial data, the lines were so noisy that the error rates were astronomical. A command sent from Moscow to Vladivostok to produce 1,000 bolts might arrive as a command for 1,000 tanks or simply as gibberish. Soviet scientists developed brilliant error correction algorithms, some of which are still used in satellite communications today, out of sheer necessity. They had to make the smartest software because they had the dumbest hardware. But no amount of math could fix the physical reality. You cannot run a real-time digital empire on a voice-grade telephone network intended for babushkas to call their grandsons. Chapter 9: The Death of the Prophet, 1982 and the End of an ERA. Glushkov's final message. In January 1982, Viktor Glushkov lay dying in a hospital bed. He had seen his dream of OGAS stripped for parts. The Red Internet had become a collection of 3,000 isolated, incompatible local ASUs that were little more than glorified accounting machines. He dictated a final letter to the Central Committee. He warned them that the West was about to enter the microprocessor revolution and that the Soviet Union was standing still. He predicted that without a unified information space, the Soviet economy would lose its coherence and eventually shatter. His death marked the end of the grand design. After Glushkov, the ASU project lost its soul. It became a line item in a budget, a box to be checked. The visionaries were replaced by gray technicians who were content to let the system rust. The digital revolution had been defeated by the nomenclatura. The countdown to 1991 had begun, not in a political office, but in the failure to connect the first nodes of the Red Internet. Chapter 10, The Data of Disaster, Chernobyl's Silent Wires. The deadline. April 26, 1986. Time, 1:23 a.m. Reactor 4 at Chernobyl explodes. It is the greatest technological disaster in history. But the real tragedy was the data vacuum. At that moment, the Soviet Union had thousands of computers. But they were still islands. There was no central nervous system. When the reactor blew, the local computers at the plant recorded the spike. But they had nowhere to send the data. There was no automated alert system to Kiev. There was no digital link to the Ministry of Health. The human filter. The information had to travel through humans. And humans are afraid. The plant director called a bureaucrat. The bureaucrat called a minister. Every person in the chain softened the data. They didn't want to be the bearer of bad news. By the time the news reached Moscow, the data was a lie. They told Gorbachev it was just a small fire. If Glushkov's OGAS had been built, the truth would have been instant. Sensors across the border would have triggered an alpha alert. The computer would not have been afraid of the Kremlin. It would have told the truth. The price of silence. For 36 hours, the city of Pripyat was not evacuated. Children played in the radioactive dust. Why? Because the paper system was too slow. The bureaucrats were waiting for a signature. They were waiting for a stamp. A unified ASU would have mapped the radiation cloud in seconds. It would have redirected every bus in the region automatically. Instead, the Soviet Union used its old-world methods. They used soldiers with shovels. They used phone calls on noisy lines. Chernobyl was the final proof that the USSR was a 19th-century empire trying to survive in a 20th-century world. The lack of an internet didn't just kill the economy. It killed people. The dream of the 1970s died under a pile of radioactive graphite. Next step for the user, Ken Kasim, these are now double the length and written with that sharp, rhythmic style you asked for. The contrast between the high-tech dream and the low-tech reality is much stronger now. Chapter 11, The Microchip Gap, Why Reform Failed. Perestroika's Missing Tool. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985, he introduced perestroika, restructuring. He knew the economy was stagnant. He tried to revive the ASU concept under the name the intensive path. But it was too late. The West had already moved into the era of the personal computer. In the US, Apple and IBM were putting the power of the state into the hands of individuals. In the USSR, the state was still trying to use massive mainframes to control individuals. The microchip gap had become a canyon. Soviet industry couldn't produce high-quality microprocessors at scale. They were still stuck in the era of copy-paste engineering, trying to clone Intel chips that were already obsolete by the time the Soviet versions hit the factory floor. The ASU, once a dream of the future, had become a museum of 1970s ambitions. Gorbachev tried to fix the machine, but the machine's operating system was fundamentally broken. Chapter 12, The Collapse, From Silicon to Scrap Metal. 1991, The Great Disconnect. As the Soviet Union began to fracture, the thousands of local ASUs became digital tombstones. When the central commands from Moscow stopped coming, the computers in the factories in Uzbekistan or Estonia didn't know what to do. They weren't programmed for market logic, they were programmed for the plan. When the USSR finally dissolved in December 1991, the hardware of the ASU was sold for scrap. The gold was stripped from the circuit boards of the BSM-6 computers. The magnetic tapes containing the economic data of an empire were dumped in landfills or used as ribbons for kids' toys. The Red Internet never sent its final packet. It simply turned off. The scientists who dreamed of a digital utopia found themselves driving taxis or moving to Silicon Valley to build the very systems they once hoped would save the revolution. The brain was dead, the nervous system had been sold to the highest bidder. Chapter 13, The Phantom and the Machine, Our Modern Algorithmic State. Glushkov's Ghost. Today, we look back at the 1970 Soviet ASU not as a failure, but as a premature future. We now live in the world Glushkov envisioned. When you look at the logistics centers of Amazon, where thousands of robots are coordinated by a central algorithm to move millions of products, you are looking at the functional ASU. The irony of history is that the command economy failed in the hands of the state but succeeded in the hands of the corporation. Big data, predictive analytics, and the Internet of Things, IoT, are the modern descendants of the cybernetic dream. The Soviet Union failed because it tried to use technology to enforce a rigid, human hierarchy. Today's digital giants use technology to create a fluid, algorithmic one. The Silicon Tsar finally arrived. He just doesn't speak Russian, and he doesn't work for the Kremlin. He works for the user. As we close this chapter of Synapse Daily, ask yourself, is a society managed by an algorithm truly efficient, or have we just traded the human bureaucrat for a digital one? The dream of 1970 is now our 24/7 reality. Thank you for staying with us through this epic journey. From the vacuum tubes of Kiev to the halls of the Kremlin, the story of the Soviet ASU reminds us that technology is never just about machines, it's about the courage to face the truth. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories. This was Synapse Daily. Stay curious, stay connected.